Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the West Virginia Archives and History Library for another presentation in our lecture series. Upcoming lectures include next Thursday, May 21st, Lewis Smoot, and first of the block lecture series for African American Experiences in Charleston, West Virginia. June 2nd, Rory Perry, the clerk of the Supreme Court here in West Virginia, will do a lecture on history of the Supreme Court of West Virginia. On June 18th, John Lilly will present West Virginia songs. June 25th, Ronald Newsom will be the second in our block speaker series, the African American Experience here in Charleston. Tonight we are delighted to have Carter and Nancy Bruns, who will discuss the J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks. The Dickinsons were early salt makers in the Kanawha Valley, and in 1832, the John Q. Dickinson salt furnace was established at Malden. Repaired after the Civil War, the facility remained in operation well into the 20th century for many years as the last salt operation in the Kanawha Valley. Carter Bruns grew up in Colorado and attended the New England Culinary Institute, where he met his wife Nancy, a native of Charleston and graduate of Bucknell University. Carter and Nancy owned and operated a small restaurant in the mountains of North Carolina until 2008. Carter received his master's degree in history and produced a thesis entitled "The Whole River is a Bustle," which examines the antebellum Kanawha Valley salt industry. He is currently pursuing a doctoral degree at the University of South Carolina, seeking to marry her love of food and deep family heritage with a meaningful business. Nancy Bruns revived her family's salt enterprise in Malden with her brother Lewis Payne 2 years ago. The J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks harvest an all-natural gourmet salt by hand and also the famous Kanawha red salt. Please welcome Carter and Nancy Bruns.
All right, if y'all can't hear me, just holler. It strikes me as very strange to be standing here in front of y'all. It's odd. 25 years ago in 6 months, I know that because my anniversary is Monday, when my wife came and sat next to me at the table that I had purposefully chosen in the corner at the opening mixer of culinary school so that no one would come sit next to me. And I wouldn't have to talk to anyone and could quickly eat my ossobuco and leave. This is how these things end up. It's very odd. It's certainly the first inclination I had that my wife has what I consider to be a relatively unhealthy attraction to challenges. When we sold our restaurant, and I thought I was going to be a great retired person because I'm so lazy, it turned out I was quite poor at it. My wife informed me, and that it was time for me to follow another passion. So I started my master's in history program with an interest in the Loyalists, a group of people that in the American Revolution who historians have struggled to really put a handle on why they made the choice to remain loyal. They seem to defy easy categorization. That took me to a couple of things that intrigued me. A letter that one of Washington's aides, Reed, had written in November outside of, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, saying, "Stop sending me cattle. I have 5,000 head of cattle. I'm surrounded by cattle. I can't kill them because we don't have any salt. We're going to have to disband the army if you don't get me some salt. Cattle, no. Salt, yes." And I was like, that's interesting. You kind of hear about people, you hear about no shoes, bloody ice from feet getting cut, You don't hear about being surrounded by cattle but not having salt as a reason for the possible failure of the rebellion. From there, I ran across interesting to me, interesting books on the series of skirmishes that sort of marked the Civil War and the Revolutionary War in in New Jersey, where loyalists and rebels took turns destroying each other's salt works. And it sort of got me thinking. It's like, I started, wow, more salt, again, salt. And I came to the conclusion that salt is a great signifier. It's like a flag. The ubiquity of it, the fact that it's absolutely necessary. And before modern geology, it wasn't thought to be everywhere. Despite the fact that the oceans were filled with salty water, you had to boil it. So unless you had unlimited combustibles, it wasn't easy to make salt. So I found that salt actually leads you great places. People do dire, interesting things to control and create salt. I had no idea, however, it was going to lead into my own living room. So but I guess it goes everywhere, right? So once you begin using salt as sort of a marker, a place to sort of dig down into history, you can be sure that you're going to find conflict and power struggles until the invention of the refrigerated boxcar. I mean, when the need for salt was diminished because we didn't need to preserve meat so long. Salt was required in vast amounts for preserving meat, in the case of the Spanish Empire, for refining silver, and for medicine. But whatever it was, you can be sure that European dreams of American commerce, they may have thought fish, and they may have thought hides, deer hides, and they may have thought, I'm going to make a fortune in hogs that I'm going to ship to the Caribbean. But they immediately also knew they had to have a ton of cheap salt to do it. First things, Jamestown immediately said, we need a French salt maker. The French were thought to be the best salt makers. So they were immediately sending for salt makers. This area, with its unusual combination, a remarkable combination of salt, strong brine, timber, coal, and not to forget enslaved men and women, made this region a natural valley of extraordinary potential wealth. Because if you were going to be a fishery, you needed salt. If you were going to harvest meat, you had to have salt. You could not do it otherwise. So Virginians immediately saw this valley as a center, as part of, well, they're Virginians, right? So they thought that, one, they're the best state, the best colony of all of them by far. They were smarter, they were more cultured, they were more intellectual, they were Virginians, right? They think that way, or thought that way. Some of them still do. George Washington looked at it and said, if the falls of the Great Kanawha can be made navigable, it will be found of equal importance to the James and the Potomac, and upon the whole, the object, in my estimation, is of vast commercial and political importance. This valley was viewed as part of a causeway and canal system that would run all the way from the Chesapeake to the Mississippi, tying this valley with the Spanish Empire, English. This valley was originally viewed as part of a major hub of commercial importance on an Atlantic basis, not an isolated valley in the middle of the mountains, but part of a major commercial operation, of which Virginia was supposed to be the host. These dreams were always international. In terms of the commercial importance, we established that with salt, but in terms of political importance that Washington mentions, it gets a little more intriguing. So Washington was concerned about how he was going to tie the East Coast to the West, the western provinces as the country spread west? How is he going to keep the western settlers in commonality with the eastern power centers? Commerce. That was how it was going to be done. And the river, the Kanawha River, from the Chesapeake to the James to the Kanawha to the Ohio to the Mississippi, was going to be one of the ties that cemented this new nation together. So that was, so this valley has always been focal to Atlantically its thoughts of empire. Salt is also an essential mineral in self-defense. One of my favorite things is to look at the different colonial responses to when they declared their independence. In Britain, all the salt had been coming over in the hulls of ships as ballast. They had found rock salt in Cheshire. Ships had been coming over, right and left, filled with cheap salt, which is what the nation needed to be a prime fishery, a prime meat capital. One of the things that the British did is they immediately said, okay, well, have fun without salt. The colonies immediately said, holy cow, what? We didn't think of that. They immediately put, their responses are different, but they have some commonalities. They generally, first off, said, okay, all the salt is now ours. Every family gets a specific amount of salt. Everything you have above that does not belong to you anymore. We're going to store it all someplace, and we will decide how the salt is divvied up, the price it's sold for. That didn't go over real well because, not surprisingly, the people in the east, the power structures in the east, didn't really think the people in the west of the states needed much salt, which was a big problem and caused civil disobedience. The other thing they did was they immediately put in programs to try and loan money, low interest loans. They did, some started their own state-owned saltworks. Let's see, special rewards for people who could make large amounts of salt quickly. Most of these were not terribly effective. My favorite response was Delaware's, who said, well, we have coastline, but not that much. We don't have that much timber to burn. I know, why don't we send ships off the coast of Pennsylvania and intercept any ships with salt bound for Pennsylvania and drag them to Delaware? So that's my favorite response, was that they were going to take Pennsylvania's salt. They limped through, but it became clear that salt was of crucial importance in military efforts. If you did not have salt, as Washington's aide had said, you were in trouble. Military efforts did not work. Let's see. So seeing the salt in the valley and seeing part of this valley as part of a large commercial highway, Washington and others, as you all probably know, invested heavily in land in this area to turn it around. This, for instance, is actually a mortgage, a sales that we were fortunate enough to have through Nancy's family, for Andrew Parks and for Washington's niece and nephew, who owned vast amounts of land. Washington and his brother, they invested in land here. We don't know if this land came to the niece and nephew through Washington or through the brother, but this is the deed of sale where the wife's husband is selling her land to her brother. It was a pretty significant. I can't remember what the number was, but it was a vast, huge, it was a very large transfer of land. So they had great dreams for the area. And as you know, Clendenin came here and tried to build up the valley, but was not terribly successful. There are a couple reasons for this, that land prices in the valley failed to rise. One is the speculators themselves. They tended to want too much for their land. There was a lot of land in Kentucky, and they wanted too much for it. Washington was waiting for just the right moment to sell his land, and he put all sorts of weird stipulations to any agreements. Clendenin, who was his agent in the area, wasn't allowed to make any deals if there was even a hint of Indian unrest, because he felt that would drive the price down. He would not allow any long-term leases. He would only allow short-term leases, which, strangely enough, there were not a lot of people who were willing to invest the enormous amount of effort to clear the land and, farm it, build houses on a short-term lease. People were, however, headed to Kentucky in droves. In the 10-year period from 1800 to 1810, the population in the Kanawha Valley rose 20%. By contrast, Kentucky went from 1790 to 1800, went from 74,000 people to 221. 10 years later, that number doubled again. Massive growth in Kentucky. That growth, I feel like I'm getting two speakers. Is that kind of weirding? I don't know what's going on with that. That growth was fueled by ranching. At this point, Kentucky is ranching country. They are growing enormous herds of cattle, dairy, pork, and all of it requires salt. And here we are, poised right here on the edge of the Ohio Valley. So we're set up perfectly. We've got the timber, we've got the coal, we have slaves, right? And we have salt, brine. So it's all a perfect match. Everything is falling into place, right? Based on this and the War of 1812, because Jefferson's embargo was disastrous and our salt supplies were cut off again, salt prices rose. People like Elisha Brooks and the Ruffners came over from Greenbrier County, right? The Ruffners were farmers and millers, and they were successful. After a big fire, though, they decided to pick up stakes and move here. They purchased some land with an agreement. Part of the agreement was that they would make salt as part of the payment. Ruffner was to, with all due diligence and speed, look for and begin making salt. And with the proceeds of the salt, he was supposed to make payments to a William Dickinson, not John Dickinson, not from your family, Nancy. But he failed to do it for some reason. Dickinson did not feel he had been good about it. There was a big lawsuit. In fact, even the Dickinson's will actually specifies the payments out to his children based on if he wins the lawsuit or not. It was a significant chunk of change he was looking to get. The Ruffners did not look for salt diligently, but they released it to Elisha Brooks, who in 1810 appears in the register as a single male. No family, no slaves, no horse. So he comes in and he makes salt in generally the old-fashioned way, which was scoop up the brine that bubbled to the surface from the salt aquifers beneath the ground. But he had an idea. He said, if I dig a little deeper, I think the surface water is fresh and it's diluting the salt. So if I dig deeper, and if I take a sycamore gum and hollow it out, and basically use it like a straw and dig it down 10 feet deep, I bet there's going to be less surface water that's diluting that, which is exactly what he found. He found stronger brine that was now considered strong enough to make it commercially useful. We knew there was brine here before, but it was generally considered strong enough to make it for your household needs, but not enough to really make any money selling it. Brooks fixed that. Before too long, he was making 150 pounds of salt a day and selling it at 10 cents a pound. He sunk by sinking this log, hollowed sycamore log, on the banks of the river, 10 feet down, and dropping a bucket in it and pulling it up with a sweep. So he was the first commercial salt maker in the valley. When the Ruffner father died, for some reason, even though he didn't diligently look for salt, in his will he told his sons that they needed to look for salt immediately, that this was of extraordinary importance that they start looking for salt. So I don't know what the change of what that was about. I've read it, and maybe some of y'all have some clue as to why he would have done that, but he did. Of the three Ruffner sons, one sold out, the other two immediately started looking for salt. And they took on Brooks's idea, but said, what if we go deeper? What if we don't stop at 10 feet? What if we stop 18 feet, maybe 20? So they decide to start hollowing out enormous sycamore logs to where the walls of the log are only 3 or 4 inches thick, and they have to be big because you have to put a man at the bottom of them under the river. The way you sink gums, which is an incredibly arduous process, is you get about 20 people, you carry this log you've hollowed out that's about 18 feet long, you've beveled one end of the log, you stand it on end on the edge of the river, right at water's edge, then you prop it up, you build a platform on top of it to add weight, and that's also your work surface. Then you build a sweep and you put that on top, and then you lower, some poor guy gets lowered down the 18 feet to the bottom of the log and starts digging. And he digs, and as he digs, the log descends, and he digs more, and the log descends. He keeps doing that. And of course, icy cold water is rushing in the entire time because you have to create a gap if the log's going to sink. So he's constantly bailing, digging. Whoa! He's constantly bailing and digging and bailing. Can he bail faster? He has to bail faster because the water will fill up to the river's height. And if you're 10 feet below the surface of the river, about halfway down the log, it's good. I mean, it's actually kind of terrifying and incredibly cold. And finally, they sunk until about 18 feet below the surface of the river, the whole tube. You cannot see this sycamore anymore. They have dug it down by hand. He's shoving claws in, to try and keep the water out as he digs faster. So because it's a losing battle against the river, they finally hit rock. This process is so arduous that one woman, a traveler named Anne Royal, said that it was so cold and so miserable down there that men could not spend more than about 15 minutes in the conditions because they got so cold and wet they stopped functioning. They had to be hauled up, were left on the riverbank, shivering. They couldn't control their muscles. And it took a while before they were able to regain control of their bodies. So it's a pretty extraordinary thing to think that these men were down a tube 18 feet below the surface of the river, digging by hand. They hit rock without brine, which was a problem for them. But the Ruffners, being inventive people, said, we can deal with this, right? In doing so, they developed the first drilled well in the Western Hemisphere. It's pretty amazing. They got a big, long, 18, 20-foot long iron pole with a bit, and they just started chipping and digging, and then eventually they had a mechanism where a log, there it is, thank you. Eventually they had a mechanism where this log would pull it up, they would actually twist. These men would use these ropes to twist the bit as they drilled down. You're nodding like you've done this before. So pretty extraordinary. They finally went down. Over and over again they tried. It's pretty amazing. After several unsuccessful attempts, they finally went down, I think, 58 feet below the surface of the river they drilled. through solid rock before they hit free-flowing brine, which amazes me that the amount of, well, let's just keep going. It had to have been incredibly hard. But they're like, yep, let's just keep going. Quite extraordinary to my mind. They hit free-flowing brine. They took a tin tube. First they started with wood and shoved it all the way down. They pulled their bit up, put a narrower straw, basically, all the way down to the free-flowing brine, 58 feet down, and then used that to keep the fresh water from contaminating the salt water, and started making salt. They made their first batch in 1808, and they sold it for 4 cents a pound, 6 cents a pound less than Brooks had sold it for 10 years before. So, but they did not give up. These guys were amazing. By 1815, Ruffner bragged that there were 52 salt works along the river. Their success bred more success, and more people came. The more people crowded in, building salt works, drilling. Among those people are Nancy's family. William Dickinson and Joel Shrewsbury were merchants in Bedford County, Virginia. They said, Shrewsbury's brothers had already been here, and he said, brother, you got to get here. This is, as was commonly thought, this place is a bonanza. We're sitting right on the edge of the greatest meat-producing area the world has ever known, and they all need salt. In fact, he bragged a little bit about how the growth had been so extraordinary. And it did. One of the things that this growth did, however, is it came complete with extraordinary environmental degradation. As he mentions in 1819, when the trees are all gone, it's okay because we have coal. It's hard to tell, but the trees in the picture, the path, can you back up one? The hills are bare in that picture. By 1819, there was not anything burnable left, according to reports, for 20 miles, within 20 miles of the salt works. There was certainly wood, but at that point, if you get over 20 miles, it became economically unfeasible to move it to the salt works to burn it. The Ruffners again came to the rescue with coal. They figured out how to turn the furnaces from wood burning into coal, which was no small matter. If you just threw coal in there, it fused into a giant mass of unbreakable burned coal, apparently, making their furnaces unusable. People brought in great minds from all over the East to try and figure out how to fix this problem, because the whole industry, they said, we're out of trees. This is an enormous problem. The industry is about to end if we can't figure out how to make coal work. Despite bringing in people from all over the East, the Ruffners figured it out again. They said, they invented a grate that worked for coal in the furnaces, and they said, let's just inject some steam in it. And what happened was that by injecting steam, the burned coal responded by breaking up into tiny little bits that could be easily shoveled out by the many slaves that were rented and hired to come to this valley and work. The environmental degradation was significant with this extraordinary growth. Ann Tyler and Royal, described the area as dismal-looking places, the sameness of the long, low sheds, smoking boilers, men of the roughest sort that can be seen, half-naked, hundreds of boatmen, horses and oxen, ill-used and beat by their drivers, the mournful squeaking of the machinery day and night, the bare, rugged, inhospitable-looking mountains from which all timber has been cut give it a gloomy appearance. She Other people mentioned that the river was undrinkable, that by as early as 1819, the canal was known as Old Greasy, because the byproduct from well drilling and from bringing up brine was often natural gas, which was pumped into the river. The river was deemed undrinkable, and we didn't mention the number of dead. Apparently, the animals that were worked to death were just tossed in the river, so it was, apparently there were a large number of carcasses floating in the river as well. So I think it's very interesting to look at this, and when we look at ideas of American industrialization, it's generally trumpeted to be somewhere around Lowell, Massachusetts, right? First industrial city, the big, and Rhode Island. But this is 1826, 4 years before Lowell's even incorporated. This valley has a fully industrialized society based on enslaved Americans. So it's a very interesting thing that no one thinks about early industrialization as Appalachian, but they think of it as backward, but maybe it was early. Dickinson and Shrewsbury were among those who came here. They joined in. They immediately came from Bedford County, ready to engage in all sorts of activities. They came with an eye to salt, but they were highly keyed into everything. They came with slaves for cutting timber, slaves that they had hired, who they actually, strangely enough, he says he had to convince the two slaves to come, be leased, there are a lot of letters that discuss having to convince the slaves to come here, which brings into question the nature of slavery in this valley at that point. It's a difficult question. They came ready to set up blacksmith shops, to sell timber, to set up mercantiles, and to grow crops, and to broker tobacco, which they hoped would be a good river bottom crop here, had been successful. And that kind of described a lot of these salt makers. They were very, very opportunistic, and they did not see their role as simply, oh, we make salt. They took advantage of opportunities wherever they saw them. So cooperages, boat building, mining when it was necessary, cutting timber. Joel Shrewsbury cut timber for years before he ever started making salt, because the timber was so valuable that you could make a great deal of money just cutting and getting timber for the salt furnaces, which worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They burned. There were rules against working on Sundays, but it wasn't profitable to let a furnace get cold. It cost more than that to heat it back up. So they worked 24/7. In 1814, the Kanawha Valley produced 600,000 bushels of salt in a year. In 1827, it produced 780,000. By 1835, 2 million bushels of salt left the Kanawha Valley in 1835, packed into white oak barrels that were made here, on ships that were likely on flatboats and paddle wheelers that may well have been made here, and floated down the Kanawha, which had been altered well enough to allow part of the year travel to the Ohio River. It was a pretty amazing opportunity. They were victims of their own success to some degree, though. They could produce salt so well that the price started dropping tremendously. It cost between 16 and 25 cents to make a bushel of salt, which at times the price of salt in Cincinnati hovered very near and even below that. They responded first by making more salt, which compounded the problem, right? So eventually they got together and said, actually not too late at all. When was the first Kanawha, I'm sorry, I'm asking y'all. Y'all probably know. The Kanawha Salt Company's first year? Why, 1818, thank you. They got together and said, let's make a deal. We're running each other out of business here. Let's all agree to make less salt. Let's agree that we will the salt we do make, we will only sell, we'll only sell a certain percentage of it on our own. The rest of it, the vast bulk of it, like 90% of it, we will sell to one organization that represents all of us. It will hold on to the salt. It will ship it downriver. It will store it until prices, the salt supplies drop enough that the prices are high enough that it justifies letting the salt out on the market. In doing so, they created what has been called by some the nation's first recorded business cartel. That may not be quite accurate. Cartel is a later term, but is certainly a significant business development combination and one of the earliest in our nation's history. So another first for Kanawha Valley inventiveness. Interestingly, as you might not be surprised to hear, those people who were at the receiving end of the salt, or who knew that salt was being stored in a warehouse near the river in some Missouri town, or Kentucky or Tennessee, howled at what they considered to be the extortionate prices they were being asked to pay when salt supplies were low. They wrote to their senator, they screamed and hollered, they demanded foreign salt, which they considered to be a better product anyway. The salt makers in the Kanawha Valley by these farmers in Missouri it was colorful. They were called vampires. They fed on the blood of innocent farmers' children. They were monarchists. They were out to put, this was the first step in returning our nation to a monarchy. They were considered evil incarnate by many of these Missourians. Not the least of the most offensive things they did was that they would not sell on credit. They could only sell, only cash, not even barter. And if you're in a frontier town in Missouri after the financial crash of 1837, there is no cash. They do complain of tremendous hardship and lack of flexibility. Basically, the salt just sat in the warehouses. But it goes to point out that this valley had, and its industry, and the people who worked and ran it here had broad visions of international markets. When they thought about the Ohio Valley, they thought about meat that was being sold in the Spanish colonies. They thought about meat that went to Cincinnati. You can see there, about halfway down on the Cincinnati warehouse, it says Kanawha Salt on the side. So they thought big, and they were very opportunistic about achieving those goals. Nancy's family, sadly, is no exception to that. Shrewsbury was a great, he had his eye all the time on land possibilities, buying more land. What could they grow? What could they, where was the timber most likely to be sold for the best price? And what are your competitors doing? During these salt cartels or salt business combinations, Joel Shrewsbury saw an opportunity that really helped set this company up to a large degree profitably for the future. As the other salt makers were bonding together, I hope I'm not about to get in trouble. I may be about to get in big trouble. As the other salt makers were bonding together to form these cartels, Joel Shrewsbury wrote to William Dickinson, this is what they're doing, but don't worry. I am encouraging them all. They need to do this, that it's very important. I'm encouraging them that this is the best course for them. And then I'm going to tell them that my agreement with you won't let me be part of it. So Joel Shrewsbury wisely allowed them to raise the price of the salt, but then didn't submit to any of the controls, limited production and who you would sell to and the price that you would sell, So Dickinson and Shrewsbury stayed out of the cartels for the most part while encouraging their actions to the greatest degree possible. I think Joel Shrewsbury was a wily, reading his letters, I wish I could meet him. He was a smart, wily, and actually a very kind man, I think. Here's a picture of the J.Q. Dickinson sternwheeler. J.Q. Dickinson became one of the largest salt makers in the valley. It certainly was the largest slaveholder in the valley at 220-something slaves that it either owned outright or hired, which of course, the whole nature of hired slavery is a whole nother discussion, but this valley engaged in hiring slaves from Eastern Virginia far more than anyone else has come up with in any other industry. Most places you hear about 25% of the slaves are hired from elsewhere. Here in this valley, the estimate Staley gives that are 50 to 60%. So it's significantly different. This charts the salt production. By 1950, the heyday for Kanawha salt is about over. The number of firms that are in it drops drastically, and you can see that the amount of salt produced drops from almost 3 million bushels, or 2.2 million bushels in 1854 to 1.4 million in 1855, dropping down in 1865, which for understandable reasons drops to 861,000. But the number drops considerably. It's producing half or less of what it did. There are a number of reasons for that. There's competition. The Cincinnati, which had been known as the pork capital of the world, Porkopolis, it has been referred to, lost that title to Chicago with the advent of trains, the Erie Canal, and Chicagoans who were just as determined and opportunistic as anyone, and they turned Chicago into the hub of the Great West. Cincinnati lost that role. That left the Kanawha Valley too isolated from its main meatpacking source. Let's see, those are the main reasons. Also, cotton production. Sternwheelers were running up the river empty. They cut some great deals for anyone who wanted to ship anything upriver, which allowed salt from the Caribbean and Venezuela and even Portugal to run upriver to the America's heartland, or at that point, the Great West of America, since salt was an international commodity. So that's really the reasons for the downfall. Certainly the Erie Canal played into it, the Onondaga region around Syracuse, New York, and of course the Michigan salt fields. They basically found salt a lot closer to where the action had moved, Chicago. But Nancy's firm stayed with it, and this is where she takes over, I believe. Now, the real reason you're here.
Let's see here. All right, so now I'm not the academic, and I don't have all of the information that he does, but I do have my family, which I've grown up in. I'm a 7th-generation member of the Dickinson family. My brother here is my partner, Lewis Payne. So I just wanted to start by going through these 7 generations, just so you get a sense of J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks, which started as the first company was Dickinson and Shrewsbury, being William Dickinson Sr. there, with Joel Shrewsbury, who came in 1813, bought the piece of land we still own, which is in present-day Quincy, from William Carroll in 1813. They bought that land mainly to cut timber. They first made salt on leased land in 1814, then bought the land in 1817 where the current Bell DuPont plant is. That's where they first made salt. They actually leased that land from Joel Shrewsbury's brothers and made salt there in 1817. Then William Dickinson Jr. came, then John Quincy Dickinson, and we'll go through these a little more. John Lewis Dickinson was my great-grandfather. His brother was Charles Cameron Dickinson, C.C. Dickinson. He's actually inherited the Malden Saltworks from his father, John Quincy, and my great-grandfather, John Lewis Dickinson, inherited the Quincy property. So the Saltworks actually came down to the branch of our family, who we now lease back this property from. So then my grandmother's Anastasia Dickinson Payne, father John Lewis Payne, John Lewis Dickinson, and then Lewis and myself are seventh-generation members of the Kanawha Valley. Here. This is the actual deed of sale of the first land in Quincy, the Carroll land from William Carroll. This is on the land in Malden. This is a derrick, and you can see how tall that is at this point. This is probably in the 20s at some point. And we still have 8 wells on the property there that you can see. So let's back up a little bit. In the 1850s, where Carter left off, the salt industry is waning. So what does the Dickinson family do? Well, first, William and Joel get into a huge fight. And their relationship begins to sour. It ends up that William sues Joel for the dissolution of Dickinson and Shrewsbury. It ends up that neither one of them lived to see how that was going to be solved. William Jr. came from Bedford County to settle this problem between William and Joel, and it was finally settled after the Civil War. Then there was a great flood of 1861. In September of 1861, the Kanawha River rose 16 feet above flood stage, and that took out quite a few of the salt works. Then we had the Civil War, which had a big effect on the salt works. Union troops and Confederate troops fought back and forth to keep control, and eventually Union troops destroyed all that they could, and is one of the many reasons that the Confederates didn't win. So after the war, John Quincy and Henry Clay, who had both served for the Confederacy and were held as prisoners of war, returned to Kanawha to help their father, William Jr., restore the salt operations. Part of that, they felt they needed to protect their money, and they started the Kanawha Valley Bank in 1867, and this grew into One Valley Bank, which was then purchased by BB&T in 2000. So they could control their bank. They could also help other families rebuild in the valley, rebuild the salt industry. But only a few rebuild. By 1876, there are only 12 on record. By the 1890s, J.Q. Dickinson and Company salt furnace was the only one left in the Kanawha Valley. The company begins to extract other products from the brine. They look at diversifying to stay alive. But people still need a lot of salt at this time, so salt production is still a big part of their business. But this brine is so rich in other products and minerals that as the valley is developing into the chemical valley, from the salt valley and coal valley, it becomes the chemical valley, they realize that this brine has other values as well. So they start selling things like calcium chlorides, magnesium chlorides, bromine products, potassium bromides, to things like film manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, mill suppliers, refrigeration companies, chemical companies. They develop a road maintenance product called dust lay that is spread on roads to keep the dust down because there's no pavement, and it also kills weeds. And it's a viscous material, so it doesn't run off and kill grass along the sides. They also start making medicated livestock products, medicated salt bricks for cattle and sheep. So they're diversifying to stay alive. This is an aerial view of the Dickinson salt facility in Malden that's taken in the 30s. You can see there's a rail line coming in kind of vertically there, and you can see the access on the river. There's still remnants of these buildings on the farm today. And if you come out, Lewis has worked really hard to clear paths, and he has kiosks set up. So if you come for a tour at the Saltworks, we can take you by there to see the old Saltworks. This is, and I'm sorry it's not very clear, but we think this is interesting. This we found in the old salt office on the farm, and it's a handwritten chart about how the salt was made. And at the top here, you can see it's brine settling vats and crystallizing brine storage and grainers, and then it goes into this salt storage over here. And that big, there's a big silo still there where they stored the salt. And then down here explains how the bromine manufacturing took place. Also in our salt office, there are enormous numbers of ledgers and record books that show everyone they sold salt to, everything they sold, all the transactions, all the pay stubs. This is a ledger book. They had a general store there, so everybody that came in and bought coffee or sugar or tea, we have all of that, which is fascinating. This is the inside of the grainers. The big board, let's see where right here, is where they would scoop the salt out of these grainers, and the salt would go up on the board and it would dry there. This is a picture of the salt workers. This is taken in 1940 with the big bags of Kanawha salt. So in 1945, J.Q. Dickinson and Company salt furnaces are closed in Malden, but the chemical production, and particularly bromides extraction, continues into the 1980s. After the 1980s, that's closed down. Then the family opens Terra Salis and Terra Care on the property, so they went into more landscaping business and turned the area back into a farm, and they have those beautiful Oreo cows out there, the belted Galloways, which we love to see every day. So fast forward another 50 years here. We're in 2012. Lewis and I see a new opportunity. With my background in food and with more and more space in my kitchen cabinet being given over to salts from around the world, I didn't really know what I was teaching myself. And the farm-to-table movement, where chefs and consumers are really wanting to source their products as locally as possible and from artisanal producers who are really making high-quality products. A naturally made mineral-rich salt with no additives was needed in this area. There are just a handful of small salt producers in this country, whereas countries such as Japan have 750 salt producers. They have a real palate for different salts. We felt we have a very protected source that's free of chemical contaminants that our surface oceans might be experiencing because it's so deep underground. So I called Lewis and said, hey, I've got this idea. What do you think? I knew he was interested in a business in the food industry, and so he jumped on board, and in 2013, we founded J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks. But we do our process really slowly, even it's much more slowly than 200 years ago. So we do it by solar evaporation in greenhouses. We still have a well. We put a brand new well in. It goes down 350 feet, and it only took us 2 weeks. It didn't take 2 years like other wells I've heard about. And then we pump this brine into greenhouses where it evaporates and crystallizes, and then we hand harvest it and package it. And at its fastest, it might take 4 weeks for a whole cycle to take place. In the winter, it can take up to 3 months to make a batch of salt. We hope this year, and we've quadrupled our capacity, we hope we'll be able to make 8,000 pounds of salt. I mean, compared to what our ancestors were making, that might be a day's production. So it's important to us to be very sustainably made. So this is our newest sun house called the Quincy. And it's important for us to have very little impact on the environment. we actually want to be completely off the grid within a few years. We're getting ready to install solar panels to run our fans and our pump. So we put the brine in these big beds, and that's how it evaporates. This is a picture of the crystals. You can see how beautiful they are, forming those perfect squares. And this is the harvest. We use a rake and scrapers to harvest the salt. This is a little earlier. We've since expanded to a new sun house where we harvest. But we harvest it into these cloths where it dries, and then we clean it and package it. Now, what makes this salt different? We can still capitalize on why Kanawha salt is great. As I mentioned, we have a very protected source here, and it's very mineral rich. And that gives you an expression in the salt, different from any other salt around the world. And so I like to think that salt is very similar to wine, that where it's grown is going to give you an expression of that product. And so our salt is very high in calcium, magnesium, and potassium, as well as about 12 other trace minerals. And it's 94% sodium chloride and 6% trace minerals. So that's what's really giving it a unique flavor. It's a really bright, bold flavor. And it is being very well received nationally. We have chefs all over the country that are using it and loving it. And I have to say that West Virginians are most supportive and really excited about what we're doing. And we're having a great time doing it. So there's our family on the farm celebrating the business. So that's the end of our presentation, and we are open for any questions you might have.
What are your hours?
Our hours?
Yeah, if you want to come up and buy some product.
Just call us before you come.
Oh, before you come.
Just call before you come, so we're looking for you, so we might be outside. Yeah, but we sell it there, or we sell it at Capital Market.
Capital Market.
Capital Market.
Purple.
Yes, at the West Virginia Marketplace. And also Eggplant carries it, the Shake Shop.
East End Bazaar on
East End
Saturdays.
Bazaar. Yes, the Sage group is carrying it at the East End Bazaar.
Also the gift shop here.
Oh, that's right, gift shop here. Yes. The obvious one, yes.
Yes, ma'am. I noticed the salt that was packaged, and I bought some salt at the East End Bazaar 2 weeks ago. It was white, but historically there was also a lot of things in Kanawha red salt. Are you all producing any of the red salt?
In fact, we are. We did make a batch of red salt and dried the salt with the iron oxide to make it for, we've had a lot of demand from historical reenactors to have that product. It does not taste good. It does not taste good. I just put that disclaimer on it. It's very metallic tasting, but, and we do have some of that with us today.
For sale?
For sale? Yeah.
Is it true that we're eating something 400 million years old?
Yes, it is true. We didn't talk about the geology. This subject has so many different subjects. It is the 400 million year old Ippitus Ocean. It was one of Earth's earliest seas and very shallow, full of life before Pangea came across, and that's when it dried up underneath. And now continents have spread back apart. Underground springs, aquifers have redissolved it here in this area, and that's what we drilled down to. It was bubbling up in places. Started to talk about animals, and Native Americans were coming to make salt, and then the European settlers, and then you know the rest of the story.
What about byproducts? Any byproducts of it?
There are. We are trying to be 100% no waste, and pulling everything that we pull out of the ground we want to use. And so as we make the salt, when we harvest the crystals, there's a mineral-rich liquid that's left. It's called nagari, the Japanese word, or bittern is the more American word. And these are the minerals that don't adhere to the salt crystals. And so it's used traditionally to make tofu, but you can also use it to make fresh cheese. It's a natural coagulant, or some people use it as a mineral supplement because it's so mineral rich, very high in magnesium. We also are looking for uses for the iron other than making red salt. We're working with some artists, potters who are using it to tint their clays and using glazes, and also a clothing company to dye it using natural dyes for clothing. So thank you.
For high blood pressure, the doctors say cut back on salt. Is there any difference in this and the salt that you would grind to store as far as affecting blood pressure?
Yes, it is lower in sodium chloride. It's 94%, so it's less sodium, and you can use less of it because it's more flavorful because of those minerals. You can actually use almost half as much. So we don't say it's a healthy salt, but it's a healthier choice. Yeah.
Early in the talk, there was a letter that was written from George Washington to Benjamin Harrison. Was that the president's?
That was George Washington's letter to Harrison in 1784 or 5, sorry, where he at that point is part of the James River Company, which is charged with creating this system of canals and tollways from the Chesapeake through Virginia to the Ohio Valley. This letter where he talks about he conjecturing that the Kanawha River and the Kanawha River Valley will become as important as anything along the James or Potomac if they can get the system of canals and tollways created. The Midland Trail, actually, I believe, follows a good bit of what was proposed. Yes.
Just to follow up on that, I think also in that same time period, to play off of Washington's stress on political, I think Benjamin Harrison, sometime in the 1780s, was also governor of Virginia.
He was governor of Virginia at the time, yes.
So this is not the president.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry?
This is like the great-great-grandfather of the president.
Yes.
1784?
Yes.
Yeah, this Benjamin Harrison was an ancestor of the president.
Sorry, I think about Washington. No.
Not the
Y'all got your Virginia history down better than I do. I'm sorry, I do not know the answer to that. I will trust y'all's judgment on that.
He would be probably a great-grandfather because Benjamin was I think William Henry Harrison, who was the President Benjamin's grandfather, was Benjamin's son, if I remember.
This president was governor at the time.
Right.
Anything else?
Yeah. The drawing that you had, it looked like it was on wood.
The drawing of what?
It's a salt process.
Yeah.
Oh, it was on wood.
Okay. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, it's carefully drawn on just this big board. It's a funny thing.
That one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just sitting in there on the desk.
Wow.
So, one little side note I thought I'd mention is John Quincy Dickinson's brother, Henry Clay, I mentioned, came back and started the bank with his father. He became the mayor of Charleston. And actually through that line, our current mayor is Henry Clay's great-great-grandson. Great-great-great-grandson. So, a little piece of interest.
Yeah, when you showed the names there, you see the names and it's like the streets of Charleston. I'd taken the tour of the Saltworks, and you had a staff, I believe a staff geologist, and he spoke a little bit about, actually spoke a lot about it, and it was very interesting what he was talking about as far as how the underground formations and things. Is there any plans to get, I guess, more wells, and there was like one well, but I heard you mention there was 8 wells now?
They had 8 wells on the property. They were running those wells almost constantly. We turn our well on about once every 2 to 3 weeks and pump 2,500 gallons, which takes about 4 hours, and then we turn it off. And then it's replenished. And we're the only one drawing on the source in the valley. At the height of the industry, there were over 100 wells drawing almost constantly. So we think we're okay with one well now, but we could put another one in.
Just
Have you
With your
considered
current-
selling the brine
Yep.
for a home salt making kit?
We could do that. We have thought about putting little brine packages together for children to have home salt making kits. Would you buy it? Bring your jug. We can give it away if you want to take it home and make red salt. But no, we haven't.
This is John Dickinson, by the way.
A long lost one.
I was going to ask, with the current incarnation of the company, and this sort of goes a little bit with what Brandy was asking, do you have some vision of how large you want to go, or or perhaps beyond which you don't want to go?
We will never be the industry our ancestors were, I don't think. I think we're looking, we have room to expand with our lease with our cousins now, but we really, it's important to us to stay small batch and keep it hands-on and keep it a really high-quality product. I can see us growing more into value-added products, possibly other food products, hams cured with our salt, or cheese making on the farm, or things like that. So we become more of a food hub. But we'll see. Right now, we're just making salt, selling a lot of it, luckily. Yeah.
Question for either of you. I noticed the name Isaac Noyes up there as one of the Cartel fellows. And I know he was also into furs. He sold a lot of furs from this region to John Jacob Astor. I'm wondering if any of the Dickinson line ever dabbled in the fur sales, or even in leather manufacture, perhaps, at the plant.
They dabbled in anything they thought they could make money in, but I do not, I've read hundreds of letters from Shrewsbury to Dickinson and back and forth, and I have not seen a single mention of either a piece of equipment or a process or a slave who was skilled in it. I've seen no reference whatsoever to furs anywhere in any of it. Lewis, have you run across anything? So they may well have, they were incredibly good at scanning for opportunities. I have not seen it. There's one other question somewhere. Yeah.
I was wondering, my daughter-in-law homeschools her children, and other parents would probably be interested in it. Do y'all do tours, and when?
We do tours for school groups. For sure, we like to keep them on the 2nd or 4th Fridays of the month, but we will schedule them at other times according to their schedule. We've had several homeschool groups come. So you can have her call us, and we'd be happy to set up something.
May I have your number, please?
I've got,
Okay.
I've got a card here. I can give it.
What about tours for the general public?
We do tours for the general public on the same dates. We'll just set them up. If you bring, it's better for us if you're more than just one person. Just get a group of friends together and come.
Do you need to call ahead of time?
It's good to call ahead of time so we can get you scheduled. It takes, if we include the salt office and kind of the historical tour, it takes about an hour. So we need to be able to set that aside in our day.
And what days was it again?
The 2nd and 4th Fridays, or the 1st Saturday of the month, we're open. But we will do them at other times.
We're not known for our sunny winters. With solar power, will you have sufficient solar power to increase your?
No, we pretty much close down in the winter. It's sort of a March through October production, although we have made the last 2 winters, we have had brine and sun houses, but it sits there.
So it is a limiting factor.
It is.
But it makes a different kind of salt. I think it speaks to the seasonal nature of this product, because Nancy's treating it like a harvested product, a product of the earth. And it actually, the winter salt is different from the main season salt, and that sort of reflects a great deal about the earth and the climate. It's very much a seasonal product.
Right, the winter salt, when it does develop, if you get a few sunny days and the brine is just right, it makes the most beautiful crystals. Very, very small, but so shiny and perfect squares. In the summer, they develop more quickly and they get bigger, a little clunkier.
Again, like wine.
We thought about trying to capture it and selling like a black label salt, but it's really not very cost effective. Anything else? Well, thank you all so much.